We're going to continue our lectures on Weber's Religion of China and Religion of India. I think what I'm going to do is in this recording, we'll focus in on Hinduism and Buddhism in India. And then in the next recording, we'll focus in on Confucianism in China. And then we'll do the comparisons probably at the end of that recording, I think. We'll do a little bit along the way here. Okay? So let me just sort of review what we did last time in a very, very concentrated way. So last time I spent quite a bit of time with Weber's General Economic History, the last lecture series that he gave before his death, in which he sort of outlines the presuppositions of modern capitalism. And my goal was to sort of give us a portrait of what Weber thought was necessary for modern capitalism to develop. And then I made the argument that what was really missing was the spirit of capitalism, and then pointing then towards his study of economic ethics in world religions as a sort of point of departure to explain why he was studying both India and China. So just to really re-summarize again, page 354 at the very end of General Economic History, in a paragraph, Weber sort of summarizes his big argument. And he says, in the last resort, the factor which produced capitalism is the, and then he lists a whole bunch of things with the adjective rational in front of them. Okay? As I mentioned last time, rational in Weber always refers to means ends calculation, right? So that means the unconstrained selection of means in pursuit of an end. So that thought and action are unconstrained by considerations that that would limit efficiency, or that would limit a kind of direct approach of an end through any action that that an actor wishes to pursue. So rational then means ends calculation. So rational permanent enterprise, an ongoing industrial concern, commercial concern, something like that, with rational accounting in money terms that allows for the projective calculation, right, of expected return on different lines of action. So if we produce one product versus another, if we produce it in one way versus another, if we produce it in one sort of volume versus another, what will be our projected profit? And then to use that projection as the basis for decision making. So Weber thought that was really important, and there was a ton of things that went into that to make sure that everything relevant to capitalism was calculable in money terms. Everything had to have essentially indexed in terms of money prices, which means alienation has to be universal in Marx's term. Okay, so rational technology, or really industrial technique, everywhere, so that there can be no sort of stereotyping of production. The worker can't really be consulted or self-determining. There has to be an entrepreneur or a manager or a supervisor who's determining the outline of work. So rational technology, rational technique, mechanization, and even fossil fuels and so on. He thinks that that development of iron and steel is really important for breaking through this, the limitations on the organic world, and then that also then leads into the use of steam power and ultimately electricity and other things too. Okay, so rational technique. So rational enterprise, rational accounting, rational technique, rational law, calculable, right? But he says in the last instance, statutory law with very sort of seamless, gapless coverage of economic activity, with the full capacity to calculate the likely outcome of breaking the contracts necessary for business concerns to come about. But he says that's not enough. Necessary complementary factors include the following things, all prefaced with the adjective rational. Rational spirit. So a kind of animating spirit to individuals and to the collective that's rational. So that means ends calculation become normative. And as we're going to talk about, that means that the sacred, right, the sort of Durkheimian sacred, the untouchable aspects of life have to be reduced to an absolute minimum, right? So Weber calls that disenchantment, a world where the sacred is drained, from this life, right? So rational spirit, rationalization of the conduct of life, especially one that is animated by an actual religious framing. So it isn't just rationalization outside of religion, but what Weber thinks is really important. You get a religiously sanctified, religiously legitimated rationalization of conduct, like along the lines of the Calvinists and so on. Okay, and then rationalistic economic ethics. So that again, the normal way that you approach economic activities through means ends calculation, and again the reconstruction of the entire conduct of life to pursue economic ethics in a universal fashion. Okay, so there you got all of these terms: rational, means ends calculation, nothing is sacred, everything is up for grabs. We calculate everything, we make decisions based upon that, right? So this leads to a world where the big questions of life, what should we do, how should we live, are based upon calculation, experimentation, innovation, progress, decisionism, really, disenchantment of the world, the profanation of the sacred. All of these things are part of it. Again, the Durkheimian world of the sacred recedes into what Weber calls values, and that values then largely get reduced down to a kind of, it isn't that they go away, it's just they become very clear in the late modern world as the world becomes more and more disenchanted, and that more and more decisions are made as though the entire world and the people within it are profane things that are completely instrumental towards the achievement of some end like profit. Okay? So nothing is sacred. You blow it away. All right. So modernity then worked through draining sacredness from the world, disenchantment. That's what rationalization is to Weber. Means ends calculation everywhere in life without the constraint of the sacred. Okay? So the Reformation, and so like in, I think what I'm going to do is show an image from my lectures on Weber's Protestant and the Spirit of Capitalism. I think this image does it. So in all world religions and in all of the great civilizations and in really all tribes and clans and villages that sort of predated modernity, the entire world was anchored down to tradition through the concept of magic. That in other words, they were immanent, this worldly, present in this world, spirits, demons, devils, spiritual forces, magic forces, totems, and so on. Right? That the entire world is full of the demonic and of the spiritual. Okay, so that is the immanent sacred, right? It's a world of magic, and that tends to lock people down into fixed ends, right? There are things that we do with our life, and it's generally reproducing the cultural patterns that were already present at the time of our birth. And then and again, stereotyping the means. So we know what we're going to do and we know how we're going to do it, and those things are sacred and they do not change. And they don't change. That's what tradition is. And they don't change because if we change them, either this worldly gods and demons and devils will attack us, or the change will unleash gods, or excuse me, demons and devils, or something that will then require us to radically, bind them back down in order for us to continue to live. So change is dangerous, right? And Weber's argument in The Protestant and the Spirit of Capitalism, and throughout all of his works as part of the Protestant ethics cycle, right, is that the Judaic God, Yahweh, right, that also is present in Christianity and in Islam, comes roaring back with a vengeance in Protestantism, especially Calvinism, Methodism, Pietism, and Anabaptism, right, in the 17th century. So the God of the Judaic monotheistic God comes back, and what that God does is leaves the world. And so what Weber argues is that the Protestant reformers of the 17th century assert that there is one God, one spiritual force, and only one, and that God created the world in a providential way and then left. So that the God is otherworldly or transcendent instead of this worldly or immanent, right? So to Weber, it is the Protestant reformers and the belief system associated with the Protestant reformers that enabled means ends calculation or rationality to permeate the world, unleashing capitalism upon us. So I just have this image here. So the transcendent God breaks through all ties, all spiritual forces. They're all gone, right? Or in Calvinism, if there's an immanent spirit in the world, it's a demonic spirit, and you shouldn't abide by it, and you shouldn't adhere to the dictates of a demon or something. And so all of life becomes rationalized in accordance with the law of the transcendent God. And that's ethical conduct. One doesn't do what one has always done. One doesn't treat the world as sacred. One treats the world as drained of spiritual forces, and then you reconstruct the world in accordance with the commands of the God that's gone. And if you follow it through, it's in my lectures on the Protestant ethic. Is that the Puritans literally didn't pray to God. God was really inaccessible to prayer. You could divine God's purpose, or you could divine providence, but you really couldn't get the God to intervene again in the affairs of life, because those are uh, that providence is underway, as it were, right? So it's this notion of predestination and transcendence and so on. Okay, so that's what matters here, is that only, to Weber, only from the 17th century forward in the northern European city states, or the northern European walled towns, did we get the total rationalization of the conduct of life, completely drained of the sacred, with profit being the ultimate end that's pursued. So the rest of life, all values, all sacred ends are essentially cut, killed, and the entire world then becomes subject to rational reconstruction to the end of profit. Okay, so Weber argues that this happens again, it's a kind of a multi-step process. It's Judaism, some versions of Christianity, Islam, but never quite all the way or fully. There's always barriers, and then it's really the Protestant reformers that unleash this onto the world. Okay, all right. So the argument is going to be then is that this rationality is the essential sort of spirit, right? The essential spirit of capitalism. And in order for that to happen, all traditionalism, right? The treatment of the already existing ways of life as sacred, right, and unchangeable, that have moral significance loaded on them, right? That has to go, and that all magic, the belief that there are spiritual forces, demons, devils, um, jinn, genies, those kinds of things all throughout the world, that those are present in the world, that has to go too, all right? And that if you live in a world where tradition matters and magic matters, you have a barrier to the full development of modern capitalism, okay? And in the end, that's Weber's argument, is that both China and India, despite having a very advanced culture, writing, business enterprise, capitalist production of a kind, uh, um, uh, at least 2,000 years ago, rational administration of a kind, at least some sector of the population being rational 2,000 years ago, full rationality doesn't develop. Okay? All right. So how does it happen? Again, in Weber's work, he keeps arguing, and we're going to talk about it before this lecture series is over. Is that in the end, the force of rationalization often comes from an emissary prophet. Because the God is gone, God cannot directly speak or possess people. So the only way that the voice of God, the commands of God, the rules of God can be known is through the revelation of a prophet, a rational sort of emissary prophet who comes with a message, right, and delivers the message. This is the Old Testament prophets from Isaiah on, right? That I've got a message. Here's what it is. Obey the law. There's no magic formulas. Obey the law. That's the only way out, right? Okay, so an emissary prophet. So again, as we look at both China and India, we're going to find that there's a lot of prophets, but the prophets tend to be what he calls exemplary prophets, people like Buddha, who come and exemplify a way of life. Follow me. Do what I do. Right? I'm going to show you the way. Taoism. I'm going to show you the way. So I'm not here to tell you what God's commands are. I'm here instead to tell you, to show you the way, right? Model me if you wish, right? Do what I do. So that's the exemplary prophet. And Weber argues that the exemplary prophet is linked into a world of imminent spiritual forces, and leads us away from capital. And it's really the emissary prophet, the kind of Judaic prophet who tells us the law, right? The law. That's the force that leads us into the rationalization of this world. Okay. All right. Okay. So I think that does it then. So it's really Judaism, Protestant Christianity, to a degree Islam, are emissary religions with rationalization. There are barriers outside of Protestant Christianity in both Islam and in Judaism and in sort of like medieval Catholic Christianity that lead away from the full rationalization of life. It's really only Protestant Christianity that does it, according to Weber, 17th century forward. All right, so let's take a look then at India first. So, all right, so what do I want you to know here? Let's walk through the Brahmins and the caste. So this is page 396 in from Max Weber, the famous collection. This is widely available, widely known. And all right, so let's do a summary first, and then go deeper into it. So really fast, this is the summary. We'll refer to this again. To Weber, India is the main barrier to the development of capitalism is ultimately Hinduism. And so we thought that Hinduism was probably the strongest possible theodicy, right? It was a total theodicy. What's a theodicy? It's the explanation for why sort of bad things happen to good people, or why a God that has spiritual power would allow injustice and so on, suffering to occur in the world. It's really the theodicy of suffering, the explanation for why God allows suffering. And in Hinduism, suffering is everything, right? One suffers because one is locked into samsara, the cycle of rebirth, right? And that each caste, right, that you are born into a caste, and the castes are hierarchical, with increasing sort of social honor and purity and even spiritual enlightened spirituality. The higher you go up, and then more impurity, less enlightenment, less spiritual power, less spiritual perfection really, and greater pollution the farther you go down. So in Hinduism, each person is born into a caste, a social category. That it's not quite a sib group. It's not quite a guild or something like that. You're born into this caste, and we're going to spend a lot of time talking about what caste means. Each caste has a dharma associated with it, a sort of a set of sort of ethical and moral constraints. If you live in accordance with them, the karma principle is that there's sin in the world basically, and virtue in the world, and sort of you strike a kind of balance in an accounting way between the virtues one is exhibited in accordance with one's dharma, and basically the vices that one has exhibited in one's life, the actions that you've done in accordance with the caste dharma, and that determines then in samsara, in the cycle of rebirth, where you're going to position yourself in the next life, right? So this cycle of rebirth is central to really all of the sort of the Vedic religions. This idea that the soul more or less hangs together as an entity and goes through a cycle of rebirths, and that if you become, over attached, or if you fail to, in Buddhism, or if you fail to live up to the dictates of your caste dharma, that you can fall in the next life. This is actually a Buddhist image, but it works here. And then if you adhere to the dictates of your caste dharma, positive karma, that you can actually be reborn higher in the caste scale, right? So everything is caste specific. There are no universalistic ethics, no universalistic vices, and no universalistic virtues. Everything is specific to the caste, right? And there's a lot of them, as we're going to find out as we go. So to Weber, this generates then a kind of magical world, a world that's absolutely chock full of spiritual forces, where your belief and your conduct is being sort of indexed at all moments, and being tracked. And yeah, so in the religions of India, he argues, there is a rational group that emerges, right? And that's the Brahmins. So the Brahmins are the group at the top of the caste scale. They're the priestly caste, right? They're the highest level of religious perfection, and so on. And they become a kind of a rational carrier strata, and they sort of set the tone for Hinduism, right? Or kind of determine the kind of overall structure of Hinduism. So the Brahmins are a closed caste with knowledge as the basis of power. We're going to find out that that's precisely the same position as the literati in China, or the Levites in ancient Judaism. The power of the rational closed status group ultimately resides in knowledge rather than in something like charisma or something like that, right? Individual charisma. So it's knowledge. They know the formulas, they know the rituals, they know the ceremonies that have to be performed, and so on. So it's knowledge that really matters. So knowledge is the basis of power. Um, the Brahmins emerged as court Brahmins, right? That serve princes, and that the Brahmins attached to a prince have more power than those who aren't, and who simply are attached to a temple, and so on. So there's kind of a hierarchy here. But let me see. But so salvation, soteriology, salvation occurs interlife, right, through the transmigration of souls, right, and that means that that one cannot pursue salvation in the world. One can only pursue salvation out of the world in the next life, right? So in Orthodox Hinduism and Buddhism and Jainism, all of these different versions of salvation, nevertheless, there are impositions of asceticism, massive asceticism, self-denial, and there's even mysticism involved. But it is almost always aimed, again, at another world, This world is denigrated in significance, and it's really the other world is the location of sort of justice and of redemption and compensation, right? All right. So, you get and if you ultimately, like in Buddhism and Jainism in particular, if you achieve the ultimate breakthrough, right, you're saved from samsara itself. You're saved from the cycle of rebirth, and that's your freedom, your ultimate mystical compensation for fully ascetically embracing world rejecting this world, is that you're free from ever being reborn, something along those lines. I guess it's a silly way to put it, but to Weber, this is the most elaborate working out of asceticism anywhere. It's the most radical working out of this worldly asceticism. But it isn't asceticism that where one is attempting to excuse me, it's not this way. You're actually rejecting this world. So it's asceticism that's aimed at the other world. So really fast, Protestant Christians were ascetic in the world. They were denying themselves pleasure and working hard in the world to achieve profit in the world, and that the ada they those who are virtuosos in Buddhism and Jainism, and even those within Orthodox Hinduism, this world didn't matter, and that whatever ascetic practices of self-denial and pain and suffering you were engaging in was going to have its compensation in the next world. Okay, so this means that so it's the most fully working out system where one is locked in to a traditional structure where the means of life and the ends of life are things that are fixed with a kind of sacred power, and that this gets reproduced in a kind of stereotyped way over time. Weber notes that Hinduism and really India is the land of what he calls massive doctrinal toleration. You can believe almost anything you want, and in many ways, the next life that you have is in accordance with whatever belief you have, right? Complete sort of toleration or near complete toleration of belief. Um, but it winds up leading to traditional capitalism um, that has demonic, magical forces in the world. The world is imminent with spiritual forces. Caste pollution rights, keeping ritual distance from those above you and below you in the caste system. A village artisanship in which you're paid not in money, but you're paid in kind within a village structure from other castes and so on. That all of this blocks the development of modern rational means and calculation capitalism, leaving capitalism in a traditional structure. So you have traditional capitalism in India, not rational capitalism. You also fail to form a polis because everybody's locked into a caste, of which there are thousands, right? Including the subcasts. So you're locked into these, and that prevents you from literally from having social relations with those in other castes that would allow something like a civil society, a shared set of interests and knowledge that we're all in this together, self-determining equals, that kind of thing. That can't happen. So it prevents the formation of civil society and the polis and these other things that Weber thought was essential, remember, to the development of modern capitalism. So that, in a nutshell, is his portrait of that we're going to talk about of India. So, so there is a carrier strata, a group, the Brahmins, who become relatively rational and who get who could have been carriers of a kind of this worldly asceticism, and he says that ultimately doesn't happen because the Brahmins are part of an overarching structure in which demons and spirits are everywhere, magic is everywhere, and that the entire populace is locked into this system either of Hinduistic samsara, caste, karma, dharma, in which, again, there's a kind of magic stereotyping of life. And the only people who escape from that are those who embrace these heterodox religions like Buddhism or Jainism. And that to do that, to break through this cycle of rebirth in the caste system, is to completely renounce this world entirely and to lead a life of extraordinary asceticism, extraordinary self-denial, extraordinary suffering. And if one does that, including the kind of systematic mysticism that goes along with it, then one can break through of the entire cycle of rebirth entirely, right? But those who are in the world don't change. They never rebel. If you do, at least that's his argument, if you rebel, that's the ultimate sort of breaking with karma, with dharma, generating negative karma, and you're going to be reborn below. So all innovations are threatening. All innovations are going to lead to a decline. So that's India in a nutshell. Okay, so let's sort of walk our way through this if we can. Yeah. So page 396. Let's see here. Yeah. All right, so caste then is developed as an ideal type here. There's ritual rights and duties that are imposed upon each caste, and even upon the Brahmins at the top. Um, the Brahmins are the fundamental institution of Hinduism, and caste is the fundamental institution of Hinduism. Sorry, without caste there is no Hinduism, right? So, and all castes are determined by the distance that they must maintain from the Brahmins. So the Brahmins are kind of like the universal equivalent, or the relative equivalent, at least, so that the relative rank of all castes is determined by the ritual pollution that the Brahmins experience when placed into contact with them. Okay, so the Brahmins are the index of all castes, ranked by position. Okay, so social rank is determined by the necessary social distance that each caste must maintain from the Brahmins. Page 397 again. The Hindu caste status order is already in disarray after British colonization, especially, but the caste structure still stands quite firmly. It's in decay everywhere. So really fast, as I just checked, there's at least 1,000 castes yet in subcastes. Um, uh, um, in India, it's surprisingly resilient yet after another century has passed since Weber's writings. Weber argues that there's about 3,000 castes yet at the time that he's writing, right? So it may be in decay, but it's still a really strong structure. Okay, so he defines the ideal type of caste by comparison and contrast with other groups. So what is a caste? So he spends quite a few pages doing this. So he distinguishes between caste and a tribe. So is a caste a tribe? Well, no. Why not? Well, he says because, first of all, castes have no territory. So tribes have a fixed territory, castes don't. Tribes have blood ties, right? That have something like, the need to engage in blood feuds and revenge for death and that kind of stuff, and that doesn't exist within caste. There's no real blood ties. Although it is hereditary, there isn't a kind of need to engage in revenge. Let's see, in tribes, there is no constriction upon the particular form of labor, the vocation that one engages in, the kind of a walk of life or job or um, craft or trade that you engage in. But the caste, in fact, absolutely does put bonds upon the ways of earning a living. Okay, that's one of the main markers of it. Tribes don't do that, castes do. And then so tribes allow a variety of rank within the tribe, but castes wind up having a kind of fixed, limited social ranking system, right? So there's subcastes within a caste, but there's always a kind of limited group. There are always people above and below who are still part of the social whole, but are excluded from caste. But for a tribe, the tribe is the social whole, and it includes all levels of social rank. Other things, the caste is not a political association, but the tribe fundamentally is. The caste is a purely social and occupational grouping, but the tribe is everything. It's not purely social, it's also political. Okay? In the caste, endogamy is essential. You must marry within the caste, but as we know, in tribes are structured with exogamy, right? You might be able to marry within the tribe, but there are going to be clans or totems or subgroupings within the tribe that are structured by exogamy, right? So there's always rules, something like incest taboos and so on, that structure tribal arrangements. But castes are always endogamous. You marry within, yeah, and then in the tribe, if one loses territory, you become a pariah people, similar to a low caste. And in the caste order, you can move up and down the status order fairly frequently if you lose your territory. Okay, page 399. So tribes and castes are different. Tribes and guilds are different. So what I like about this little section is that it really shows Weber at work. This is how Weber thinks. Comparisons, contrasts. He's generating an ideal type of the guild, an ideal type of the tribe, and then he's creating an ideal type of the caste in comparison and contrast to it. And again, like this is what Weber does in the great encyclopedic 2-volume Economy and Society. Is he generates an incredible volume of ideal type concepts that allow sociologists and historians and political scientists to sort of analyze the structure of a society. Okay, so an actually existing caste is probably going to have variation from the ideal form that Weber is talking about here. Any actually existing guild is going to have variation from it, but these are sort of pure types, pure forms, pure measuring sticks that allow for analysts um, to measure a given society to see to what degree the groupings within it align with caste or guild. Okay, so is a caste a guild? Well, both deal with occupation and social rank, but castes generally override guilds. The spirit of the caste dominates over any guild organization that occurs within India. But guilds are usually, again, especially Western guilds, are linked to a particular city and a town. In fact, they become the kind of social organization of the political structure of the confraternity of the walled town in the West. So the guilds are really important, sort of units of political order and economic order in the West. And in India, the caste takes over many of these roles, and where guilds exist, the caste overrides it and dominates. So the guild is linked to salvation religions in the West, and the guild didn't lead to did not lead to city autonomy, civic political avocation in India. I see. Yeah. So the guilds in the West are linked to this independent city and city autonomy, free from aristocratic control. But guilds in India, you don't become civic or associations. They're very narrow occupational groupings, and so the caste structure prevents something like guilds becoming important political institutions. So the caste overrides guild in India. Okay. In India, the caste is a magical structure with polluting capabilities, right? A caste pollutes above and is polluted by those below, right? So every caste is magically held in place by pollution rules. So you can pollute those above by contact with them, and you can be polluted by those below, right? And then you have to engage in ritual purification, and there's all these sort of rules of social distance that prevent the ritual barriers that keep the different castes separated. But in guilds, there isn't anything like that. So there's no ritual barriers for a member of one guild to interact with another, to have dinner with them, to even mate with, say, the daughters and sons of the other guilds. So none of that happens, but that's the essence of what a caste is, right? Is these rules against intermarriage, against eating meals together, against talking, okay? All right. All right. So there are no pariah people, except for, like he says, like the knacker, the person who we would call them rendering, people that put down or kill or render dead animals, or people who engage in like hanging criminals. These would be sort of the pariah people. But except for that, a few opprobrious trades, everyone else can eat together, talk together, intermarry, and so on. But the essence of caste is that you can't do that. There are ritual prohibitions against intermarriage, eating together, and having social intercourse of various kinds. Castes are hereditary, but crucially, guilds are not, right? With just a few exceptions, they're not. Okay. Okay, what else? The caste, let me see. In the children must stay within the caste. You're born into it, you stay there. You don't get to choose your occupation. You have to stay within your caste. But the guild structure, we know that children are apprenticed, can be apprenticed to a different guild, in fact, often are, and children are expected to choose the specific master, the specific caste into which they're going to work. There's very little income security within a caste, although some castes have some basic minimum support for the members of the caste. Weber's going to think this is really important for preventing the full rationalization of the labor force, like in the West. But the guild is a very strong, ensures income security for the members of the guild, right? So there's a little bit of income security, and here you get a strong amount of it. Both are different from the Western capitalism as such, but again, differences in the caste versus the guild as ideal types. Page 402, ritual barrier to fraternization. Again, you can't have simple social intercourse with members of a different caste, but again, you absolutely are expected to fraternize and to become members of a kind of polis or commercial society or a city society. And then eating together and festivals and so on is the essence of a guild. By the way, Weber spends quite a bit of time talking about the Catholic Mass. The Catholic Mass is essentially a meal, right? You come together to celebrate the Eucharist, and that the Catholic Mass includes everybody within the territory. And so it doesn't matter what your guild membership is, you eat together at the Mass, right? It's a ritual meal, and that this is absolutely barred within the caste system. Okay, so page 403, ritual defilements. Uh, yeah, so there's ritual defilement even by being seen. Uh, um, uh, yeah, um, yeah, so I was going to sort of show that. Should we do that? Page 403. Um, yeah, so page 403. Yeah, the ritual defilements, yeah, are amazing here. So um, he talks about the British creating soup kitchens during times of famine, great famine. But this was a problem because it would ritually defile the Brahmin to eat a meal with a lower caste person, and so they couldn't do it. So the impoverished Brahmins, right, would actually starve to death. And so they came up with this make do of using chalk lines, right, to create separation, right, a kind of barrier between the different castes. So yeah. So the open ritualistic they created back doors around the ritualistic pollution rules that enable people to both eat together in soup kitchens and so on during times of famine, and that this also happened during like in workplaces and so on as well. Okay. Um, yeah. So yeah. Um, so Christianity broke down almost all ritual defilements in the West. That was gone. If you eat the Lord's Supper in common, right? This created, this broke it down, right? Right. You're part of one community at that moment. So you can't have caste and Christianity at the same time at core, right? All right. More about that. I mean, it certainly happened in the American slave South, where black people were clearly, even though Christian, were clearly treated with a massive caste barrier. Um, there were workarounds there too, like in Bruton Parish in colonial Williamsburg, black slaves were required to basically stand outside or stand in the hallway, right? That kind of thing. They really weren't allowed in to the service, right? The Eucharistic service. And of course it was Anglican, but there was even rules about who was going to be like the upper caste people had their own sort of like booths sort of set aside, and the commoners massed in common, and again the outcast of blacks wouldn't be allowed in the building at all. Where you're buried mattered, right? Like upper um, planter caste aristocratic plantation owners were often buried under the floor of the church in Bruton Parish in colonial Williamsburg. Common people might be buried out in the churchyard. Blacks wouldn't be buried there at all, right? They'd be buried in some unmarked grave somewhere else, right? So this isn't complete, right? You can still have caste in Christianity, but it works against it, right? Whereas the logic of the caste system, there's no church. There is no church of Hinduism, right? Because you can't bring the different castes together in the same place. So this presents, page 404, a barrier to the development of a city, a civil society, a political group, right? Which keeps aristocratic princes in power by playing the various castes off of each other, and that stereotypes people into a traditional economic ethic, whereas the guilds in Christianity is the foundation for the modern city, brings people together into a sworn confraternity with equality, mutual determination, and so on, and ultimately the development of rational capitalism. So again, this winds up being very, very important. Page 405. Caste is a status group. How are these two things different? Well, Weber just says, look, caste is the ultimate closed status group, right? You're a member of this, you're born into it, no one else can get in, you marry within, and so on. Status groups in general are usually determined by the style of life, the occupation, the income that the person has, the prestige associated with membership in the group, the social honor and status owner that's involved in it. Well, that's all true of caste. They can be relatively open or closed. Usually there's some status decline when you engage in what's called mesalliance, when you're either marrying between, eating with, or simply having fraternization with someone from another status group. That often leads to you being sort of getting lower status. But this, again, is absolutely stereotyped within the caste structure. It's, again, the ultimate status group. And then caste-like barriers, high nobility, between like the nobility and the U.S. As a whole. I'm not sure what that means. Let's just leave that out. But anyway, the idea that Weber gets to page 405 is that caste is a status group. It's like an ultimate form of it. Page 406. So caste, mixed blood, any mixed blood child falls below either parent. This is a strange rule whereby where high caste men could marry many low caste women, right? With polygamy, men could marry down, but women couldn't. So women would lose caste if they married down, but men didn't, and that created this strange market in these strange marriage markets, right? And so he talks about that on like page 406 and 407, right? That high caste women wind up having relatively poor marital prospects and actually their parents often have to pay a high caste man to marry them. And then he writes about all these strange child marriages that take place, right? The wives in residence and so on. You get wives that are aged 5 to 10 and extremely and the husbands have sexual access to them, and so you get, it sounds horrible actually, but we'll just leave that aside. But you get these weird dynamics even in marriage that come about due to caste. Page 407. So caste increases the insignificance of status upon marriage. Page 408, ritual purity. Eating, drinking, socializing, very strongly stereotyped. So it isn't just marriage, it's this as well. Page 409, he writes about barbering, laundering, getting manicures and pedicures, that all of these things are really difficult due to caste rules, right? Who can touch you, who can help bring about, again, barbering and so on. Page 4, and again, if you're a high caste barber, you can't provide service even to wealthy lower caste people without it being polluting to you. So page 409, a key distinction of the caste system, religious and ritually maintained system. The ritual order is oriented primarily to the maintenance of a social hierarchy, right? So that's the whole thing. So page 409, this is what Weber thinks really matters, is that the system of Hinduism is ultimately the greatest sacredness is and pollution is attached to maintain the status hierarchy, right? So it isn't to prevent some angel or devil from attacking us as a group. It's really about maintaining the status hierarchy. That's the center of the system. So maintaining the rank ordering. So there's about 3,000 castes in 1901, still over 1,000 today, plus 25,000 or so subcastes. So again, you get the Brahmin caste surrounded by the twice-born caste of the and who are absolutely ritually clean. They wear the holy belt. Surrounding that is like the Satsudras, who are the clean Sudras, the clean workers, who the Brahmins may take food or may take water from them. And then you get the Sudras. Some low caste Brahmins might accept water, but they're not going to accept food and that kind of thing. And then you're going to get rank ordering of the Sudras, the workers, depending upon, again, like what rank of Brahmin would be able to take water from you, that kind of thing. So the rank of the Brahmin that's able to take food or get services from you or deliver services to you is going to determine your rank. So you get this incredible, people are really, really alive to this of social prestige and relative rank and so on. And that again, these are pollution rules, and it's going to be one of the primary ways that you either gain or or lose in rebirth, as to whether or not you hold on to these rules. Avoiding the polluting those above and not allowing those below to pollute you is a major determinant of the cycle of rebirth. And then below this entire system, so this is the caste system, and below that are what used to be called untouchables, the Dalits now, right? Um, Unclean castes, right? That they're barred from going into any temple. Um, they're barred from the Brahmins. They must live segregated lives, maintaining 64 feet of distance and so on. Otherwise, they defile, that kind of thing. And then below even the untouchables are outsiders, tribes, migrants, those of mixed caste who have fallen down, and so on. So you get this entire world that's based upon rank ordering, and where sacredness and ritual order and religion itself is fundamentally tied to maintaining these ranks. So if you are ambitious and wish to work your way up, the only way for you to do it is to, number one, adhere to the specific rules of your caste, which require you to socially distance yourself from and honor and fail to pollute those below, and maintain social distance from and ritual segregation from those below. Know your place, keep your place, right? And then look for higher rebirth in the next life, or move into one of these rapid ascetic salvation religions like Buddhism or Jainism, where you have the opportunity to blow away, just you fall outside of the entire caste system, and you attempt to break through the cycle of rebirth through enormous asceticism and mysticism in this life, right? All right. So page 410, read regarding subcaste rank criteria. So let's see if we should do that or not. Yeah. So page 410, the upper caste. Yeah. So here's what determines the gradation of caste rank. The correctness of life practice in regard to suborganization, endogamy, child marriage, widow celibacy, cremation of the dead, ancestral sacrifices, food and drinks, and social intercourse with unclean castes. So that's what again, this is what you're ritually alive to, and that's what determines your relative rank within the upper caste. Castes of lower rank sometimes raise stricter demands than castes who otherwise are considered to be of higher standing. So it's sort of like in America, where you get a middle class person being extremely alive to caste distinctions, greater, and be much more sort of harsh on those below and much more rigid than the higher castes above. This is that British television show that my daughter likes from like the 1990s called Keeping Up Appearances. It's about a woman who's barely holding on to the middle class, but who is very alive to differences in class ranking and aristocratic ranking, and is always trying to be passing herself off sort of as a person of high status. So like she's farther down, but she's very alive to these differences. The point of that is that anytime you get this kind of caste-like ranking, you get people throughout the entire system who are very jealous of their privileges and are going to use their life energy to maintain the position that they're in, right? So this works against any kind of formation of equality or political alliance or anything else, and it certainly works against changing the system as a whole, right? Because even if you're relatively low in the caste order, there are still many, 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 many people below you. So you're going to be very rigid about maintaining the privileges associated with your caste, and you're not going to be jealous and angry of those above because you're going to identify with them versus those below. So this is a major problem in America at the moment. I think that this is a big part of the kind of the white identity movement that's underway right now, where those who don't have native status, the nativist movement in America, that if you're not a real American, born here, white, that kind of stuff, part of the middle section of the country, that you're treating others as though they're below you in rank. And instead of bonding together with people of color or people of difference or people in cities or something like that, there's a kind of identification with upper class people, and then and then where one uses one's energy to keep those below down. So you're maintaining and reproducing a system of inequality rather than bonding together across, class lines to form um, an agent of change, something like that. So it's really interesting. So American inequality is class inequality primarily, but as we're seeing now, especially in the second decade of the 21st century, that identity linked to native status, to European background, to whiteness, right, is becoming very politically potent in our time. So all of that is very similar to this caste system here. Okay, so the kinds of occupation and income which entail the most far-reaching consequences for connubium, commensalism, and ritual rank are decisive in the case of all castes. Okay, so connubium, being able to marry, so it's endogamy within caste. So even with sub ranks and subcastes, if you can marry within a group, that puts you in a different category than if you can't. Commensalism is eating together, and ritual rank is, again, those rules of social distance that maintain difference. Okay, so even subcastes can ban others. Okay, yeah, because okay, yeah. So there can be ritual impurity that's greater between castes than within subcastes. That's the general rule, but there are exceptions to it, where some castes can be even more aggressive towards other subcastes within their caste than between castes. But in general, the social distance and the ritual impurity is greater between. Okay, page 411. Again, just kind of keep your eye on this in the American system right now, and really throughout global modernity, as we're getting these 21st century identity movements that are reigniting some of these old categories in something like caste barriers or ritual pollution, rites of intermarriage and dating and dining together and again, ritual purity. These kinds of things are coming back with a kind of vengeance. And they're preventing, as Weber says, this is the big problem with the caste system and democracy. It prevents democracy because you can't get a polis to form across the caste lines. There's rules that prevent fraternization across the castes. So if people who are different from you, who are ranked different from you, are unable to be approached and talked with, to form common cause with, to talk about political needs and political goals and so on, if that's impossible, then it works against the formation of democracy, and we wind up with, as Weber says, something like upper caste rule instead. Okay, page 411, caste and traditionalism. He agrees with Marx that the village artisans, he says that India is a nation of villages and that the village artisans tend to be paid in kind, with all kinds of barriers to the development of a money economy and that kind of stuff. And he thinks that he agrees with Marx that keeps traditionalism in play. In practice, he claims that mixed caste employment was possible, especially in British factories. It was possible. There were flexible caste categories and so on. The hands of workers and servants and repair people and artisans were ritually pure. So there was this notion that even a person who would normally be impure to you wouldn't be impure to you when they're performing a professional service or when they're doing work. Commodification, a commodity that has been produced by unclean hands, itself becomes clean when it goes to the market and is purchased, right? So there's all kinds of ways that Weber argues that the post-British trade and post-British employment across caste and caste barriers, there were ways to work around it, right? So so workshops were considered clean places. Ritual defilement was largely suspended. However, that was only true for the moments of work, and that as soon as workers would stop working, they could work next to someone, but they couldn't eat with them or talk to them about matters outside of work, right? So there was all kinds of ritual defilement that still went on in the workplace, even though the actual work itself wasn't defiling. But he said, page 412, that the spirit of the caste system obstructs rationality everywhere. People become fixed in place and wind up with a ritually just fixed work process. So capitalism's modern organization could never have originated, paid forth, couldn't have originated there. Hinduism and caste would have prevented India being the incubator of modern capitalism. There was a constant threat of ritual degradation and pollution that served as a barrier to economic rationalism. So it could have been done, and it was done. But the idea is that every contact you have with everyone is potentially polluting, and every activity that you engage in has the potential to break with Dharma and generate negative karma, leading to a lower rebirth, right? So he says that this kind of tends towards economic traditionalism everywhere, and it was a barrier to means ends calculation. You tend to reproduce the ways of life, the rules of life, rather than embrace something new, simply because you're used to a structure where everybody threatens you with pollution. Okay? All right, so artisan traditionalism, even commercial capitalism was shackled by caste. Completely traditionalist Indian trades is the term that he used on 413, that worry more about producing concrete quality products rather than abstract profit. So he says this, right? If you're a traditional craftsperson, you're not worried about making money. You're actually binding your energy and your life into your work. And so having the right, quality of work that's produced at the right level, that's more important than the production of profit. Okay? So it's concrete, qualitative production of a good instead of the abstract production of value in Marxist term with profit. See, economic tradition, page 414. This is traditionalism. You work to live, and you won't work any more than that. So Weber writes about this throughout the Protestant ethics cycle, about how the traditional economic ethic is where one works to live. And if you increase something like the pay rate, people will work fewer hours. If you increase the what's called the piece rate, where you pay more for each piece produced, people will produce less and quit, because the goal of work is to support life. And he claims that the modern economic ethic, the spirit of capitalism, the ethic is to live to work, right? Where if you increase pay, you'll work harder, right? Because you're making more. All right. Page 414, he argued it took 2.5 times the number of workers in an Indian factory than in a European one, plus much more extensive supervision to get the same amount of work because of economic traditionalism. So again, workers in the West will work harder, longer, and more aggressively in an abstract way. Workers in India with economic traditionalism would stop working, wouldn't show up. You took 2.5 times the number of workers to keep a factory going. I think that's interesting. Workers can work across caste, but not eat, sleep, or associate or fraternize across caste. Hence, all worker organization is impossible. No civis or polis can come up. Okay, so I think that gives us most of what we want. I think, you know, I think that, so just like, let me just point to a few things. If the character of Brahmanical religiosity is a chapter in Weber's book, The Religion of India, okay? And one of the things that he keeps arguing over and over and over again is that this is a system that prevents the emergence of a universalistic ethic. Everything is constrained within a caste or a subcaste. So the Brahmins only are really worried about articulating the privileges and rights and duties and rationality even among the Brahmins, not elsewhere. So Orthodox Hinduism is a structure of particularity, not universality, and therefore it stereotypes that the entire social system winds up stereotyped. Everything is a ritual offense against a particular dharma, so you wind up locked in. Different karma and different conditions. Yeah, different karma conditioned by where you're at within the system. So you don't get economic universalism. You have absence of ethical absolutism or universalism, and you don't even develop the concept of the natural right, that kind of thing, which even China develops. So in Hinduism, all particularity, no economic universalism. Yeah. So the Brahmins in India are priests, initially magicians. In China, the mandarins aren't, right? So the literati, the scholar officials in China, the bureaucrats, they don't really have magic or sorcery. They're not really, they're secular. The Brahmins remain religious. We think that has a lot of much is significant as a result of that. Yeah, he says that asceticism, Indian asceticism was the most rationally developed in the world. So nowhere in the world do we have asceticism that becomes more systematized and rational than in the West. So he writes about asceticism in India as being a technology of salvation, right? So so asceticism was used to control the gods, right? Um, yeah, even in like the goal ultimately was to be totally ascetic, that you could really generate again maybe a really high rebirth by allowing yourself to be buried alive, at least in some virtuosos. So dying conscious, being buried head down, downward suspension of the head, live burial, that kind of thing, right? Ascetic magical potency was conditioned through a sort of hysterical brooding intensity. The charismatic attainment of magical potency was still processed. Imminent rationalism of knowledge and culture obstructed irrational, orgiastic, ecstatic asceticism. The status, pride of cultured men resisted undignified demands of ecstatic therapeutic practices. So, in the Brahmins in India tended towards this. They abandoned orgiastic, enthusiastic magical potency, the charismatic proof of magical potency, and shifted instead to this rational, you know, ceremonial, priestly conduct. So it was the Brahmins were they had rules, but they were rational, kind of calm, and so on. They rejected the mead orgy. The Brahmins were not ascetic in everyday life. However, women were excluded because women were viewed as more associated with orgiasticism and that kind of stuff. More about that. Page 152. Brahmins required extraordinary asceticism for great rebirth. Yeah. So again, if you really wanted to move up, you couldn't just follow your Dharma. You had to have this there's always a surplus. Surplus asceticism was necessary for a truly high rebirth. Okay. And then I wonder if we can just say, so just to point to it, Weber then goes on like page 192 to talk about the two great heterodoxies of Jainism and Buddhism, and which really involve a kind of dropping out of the caste structure altogether. Often fairly high caste people drop out of it and engage in extraordinary asceticism in which the body is evil. That's like in Jainism and so on. Starving oneself to death, extreme renunciation, being homeless. Jain's asceticism was pushed to an extreme point. So it was magical asceticism, world renunciation, right? This world is renounced. So you're very ascetic in the world as a sign of rejecting it, right? Being homeless, and so on. Absolute nakedness, not owning anything, not having any property, not providing for oneself. As one goes, you wander without any provision. All of that was important. Then you had to not kill any life. That was essential to being a Jainist, right? And so, you had to sort of like sweep the path that you walk on. The correct Jain will burn no lights because it might burn moths. He kindles no fire because it would kill insects. Water is strained before boiling, not to clean it, but to remove any life from it so that you're not killing life. Covers his mouth and nose with a cloth to prevent the inhalation of insects. Only after carefully sweeping every bit of earth with a soft broom does he step on it, lest he kill lice with the scissors. He does not cut the hair on his head or body. Instead, he plucks the hair out at the roots. He never goes through water, lest he step on insects. So you can see how this puts no possessions. Although Jainists were allowed to accumulate wealth, they couldn't enjoy it. And so there was this strange thing where there were groups of Jainists who became quite wealthy because they engaged in this worldly asceticism coupled with that it's okay to be in business. Um, so they became commercial capitalists, and party claims they became money lenders, quite honestly, and resident merchants. They couldn't travel because they'd step on something, but they could be resident merchants. He claims they became quite well to do because they had Quaker style ethics and business ethics. So ascetic consumption, ethical business practices, and it was like the only way that they could earn a living was engaging in trade or borrowing money because they wouldn't have to kill anything, right? Because there were all these other walks of life that were barred from them. Okay, so that's Jainism, and then Buddhism again is kind of this thing. He's got this really interesting analysis of Buddhism. He claims that Buddhism ultimately is a religion of virtuosos, right? To be a full Buddhist is to, like Buddha, the exemplary prophet, is to drop out of the world and to, sit under a tree and to contemplate the world, right? And so I just his analysis of Buddhism is very interesting. It should have, he claims, remained a religion of virtuosos. Only people who dropped out of everyday life could become a Buddhist monk and could engage in the kind of mysticism, systematic mysticism, and systematic asceticism necessary to become a virtuoso Buddhist. But somehow or other, he says, this winds up becoming one of the world's great missionary religions. And part of it is, in the last instance, where's my picture again? Yeah. So what he argues is that the Buddhist winds up in a way similar to Brahman. So the Buddhist master or the Buddhist monk became viewed as a kind of sacred figure, a this-worldly magician or this-worldly sorcerer by the masses. And so the masses who had to work and couldn't engage in the ascetic and mystical practices of the Buddhist supported them. And so there would be this gift giving and exchange between the Buddhist monk who renounced everything and contemplated, and the masses. And if you've ever seen the kind of the Buddhist temples of Nepal or rural India, other parts of Southeast Asia, astonishing Buddhist temples that are supported by the masses, right? Who give money in order with the belief that the Buddhist master, the Buddhist monks, by engaging in their activity, will keep the entire system going, right? And there's even I'll talk a little bit more about this when we talk about the religions of China. There's even Buddhist amulets and talisman that were sold, just like in Taoism. More about that in the next video, where magical, spells, magical incantations, binding of demons, and these kind of things would be sought from the masses at the bottom, the peasants and so on at the bottom of the system, from the Buddhists. So the Buddhists want to trading in magic. In the writings of Thorsten Veblen, he claims that you have basically two upper castes. You have the warriors and the priests. The warriors use physical force, and the priests use cunning. Is Veblen's terms, trickery, cunning, and then in essence, this is what the Buddhist monks were doing to Weber, that they were selling magic to the masses, and the masses viewed them as magicians and sorcerers who would engage in this for them. So we know Taoists definitely played this role in China, but Buddhists to a degree did within India, and Taoists within India as well. So okay, so I think that leads us more or less to the end of our discussion of India. So again, really fast, in India, Hinduism, caste, karma, dharma, samsara, the cycle of rebirth, led to this total sort of explanation for suffering in the world that locked the entire system into stereotyped reproduction. It's probably the strongest traditional system ever created that locked people into both treating the means of life and the ends of life as things that are either sacred or would be ritually polluting and demonic if altered. Okay, so this led to then to this massive closed caste system, and the only way to focus on salvation was on the rebirth in the next life, or if you couldn't get that far, or if you were really hungry for high birth, you would do something extraordinary, like engage in massive levels of asceticism, including self-starvation and so on, in this life, in order to achieve salvation in the next. Okay? So to Weber, in the end, rationality was constrained to the Brahmins at the top, and that others within India remained embedded in a world of immanent forces, immanent demonic forces, immanent magic forces, and there was no rational force coming to cut the ties of magic and immanent demons and so on. Hence, India, almost like no other place on earth, he thought, remained locked into a world of tradition supported by magic and other immanent spiritual forces. Okay? All right, we'll come back and we'll do China and then the comparison next.